Let me say this. I think God's choice for Israel's first king is, from a human perspective, a strange choice. We wouldn't choose the way God chose. God chooses Saul, and you would think that God would choose a man who is confident in himself to be king. Yet Saul, despite being a tall man standing head and shoulders above everybody else, is a man with a poor self-image. Now, why do I say that Saul has a poor self-image? There are a few reasons, but I'll focus on two. Firstly, when it's time to proclaim Saul as king, he cannot be found, and they inquire from God where Saul is. And then God tells them that Saul is hiding between the baggage, and they have to go find him. And then the text says they have to take him to the people. So it sounds as if he was forced to go. Not an awe-inspiring start for the king of Israel, is it? Then there's another pointer to this poor self-image which we find in Samuel chapter 15, verse 17. Samuel says to Saul, "Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel?" Now, I know that verse is only found in that form of translation in the ESV, but it fits perfectly. We are given by God a peek into Saul's inner world, into his inner space. And in his inner space, Saul does not feel big or in control or worthy. He has a low self-image, and whatever is going on inside does not reflect the outward mask. And the strange thing is that God has appointed someone who sees himself as little in his own eyes as the king of Israel. And what is even more fascinating to me is that God has an expectation that this Saul with a low self-esteem should properly fulfill his calling as king. I know this because Saul fails in his calling, and then the Bible specifically tells us that God regrets having appointed Saul as king over Israel. So it's there in the text. And if you think about it, this means in simple terms that Saul could have chosen differently. He could have acted differently. He could have fulfilled his calling. If God had an expectation for him, he could have fulfilled his calling, even though he lacked self-esteem, even though his inner space was messy and far from perfect. And I know some of you are complaining in your hearts, and yes, I know that God knows what will happen, and so the question is, how can God have regret? In fact, 1 Samuel 15 verse 29, it stated that God does not have regret like a man. Yet, in verse 34, it states that God did regret his decision. So we have two versions, two statements made by God. Now, I cannot explain the mystery, the tension between the two, but there they stand in the Bible, and it's simple. It is not yes or no. It is a mystery, but God regretted his decision because Saul never took up fully his role as king. And one of the fundamentals of leadership is that you have to be able to make unpopular decisions. You see, you cannot be a people pleaser and a people leader. The two don't go together, people pleaser and people leader. You cannot fulfill the objectives of leadership and not step on people's toes. Impossible. And I tell you this, you can definitely not fulfill the objectives of God in a world bowed down to Satan and not step on toes. If you apply godly objectives in your life practically, you will come into conflict with the world. You will step on toes, whether you're a leader or not. Because people pleasers fear men first and God second. What they really crave is affirmation on the wave of their self-esteem, which is low. And that's why you find the irony also in our text of Saul erecting a monument for himself after the Amalekite raid. A monument to a man who thinks little of himself when he's alone in his tent. Do you see the irony? It's a seeking, a craving for affirmation. This is a man who is scared to take up his calling and act like a proper king, yet he erects a monument to himself. You see, God instructed Saul to destroy the Amalekites. Man, woman, child, infant, ox, sheep, camel, and donkey, the whole box and dice had to be destroyed. But Saul spared the Amalekite leader, and he allowed the leaders of Israel, the other ones, and the Israelites to keep the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fattened calves, and the lambs. In fact, the Israelites took all that was good. And so Samuel interrogates Saul, and eventually Saul confesses to Samuel, and he says this, he says, "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice." Saul feared pleasing people more than he feared pleasing God. And you know, people pleasing, if it's in your life, I want to tell you today, it's a snare. Proverbs chapter 29 verse 25, fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. Saul steps right into this snare and he's caught out. And he has to confess to Samuel. But here's the irony again, the strange thing. Saul continues with his people pleasing. He's addicted to it. Saul does not want Samuel to leave him after admitting his sin without Samuel first honoring him before the people. He doesn't want Samuel to leave and then he looks bad. His image is everything to him. And if you think about it, he does not really have remorse for his sin, does he? Because actually he continues along the path of seeking people's approval. As long as he looks good, as long as he looks okay, that's what's going on in his inner space. And what a sad state of affairs. The prison of every people pleaser. The prison of ever-changing opinion of people. In other words, you're bound, you're shackled to the opinions of people. And I tell you, the opinions of people are X today and Y tomorrow and Z the next day. They change. One day they give you accolades, the next day they crucify you. What a sad state of affairs to be bound by the opinions of people. So I close with some application. Each believer has a high calling, just as Saul did. We are all ambassadors for Christ, those of us who have been born again. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 20. We hold the offices of priest, prophet and king at home and in this world through Christ. And it's an impossible task, yet God equips those whom he calls. And he calls people whose inner space is very rarely in order. He chooses, or according to the Bible, 1 Corinthians, he chooses the weak to shame the proud. So if you think about that, faith is really accepting my high calling and taking responsibility for it, even though I am not capable of it. Why? Because I move in his strength and his name and not in my brokenness. And if a monument is to be erected, it is to be erected to God, because he is the one who provides what I need. But we must guard against that which is in our inner space, whatever it may be. We must get to know ourselves through taking up our calling. You have to take up your calling. It's in the trenches, in the warfare, that the heart will reveal itself to you. Thoughts of low esteem, when they come up, must be taken captive and banished. We must also test our hearts for the practice of people-pleasing. People-pleasing manipulates and lies to get what it wants. And what it wants is the opium of human approval to numb out the pain of feeling small and not in control in this world. People pleasing is a snare, just as drugs are, and gambling and pornography. It enslaves us to the opinions of others, and it leads to disobedience, as you see it led to in the life of Saul. I say this, that people pleasers cannot fulfill the calling of God on their lives. It's impossible. So may God bless your inner space with healthy self-esteem, pureness of heart, humility, and painful honesty. May God grant you the fulfillment of your calling and callings. And may you, when the chips are down, please God, not man. Amen.